we'll have a Q&A session for maybe about half an hour. So if you'd like to ask a question, I'd ask you just to line up there in the center aisle.
Well, Sanders raises real issues, unlike all the other candidates. The problem is that he decided to run as a Democrat, and because the Democratic Party is part of the problem. And he has also promised to support the nominee. And if you look at the structures of the Democratic Party, the process by which the nominee is selected is completely rigged. There's very, very little chance that Sanders can be the nominee. In fact, I think it's impossible. And I did 2 events with Bernie, one in Wisconsin and one in New York the night before the climate march, and I was there with the socialist city councilwoman, Shama Sawan. And both of us kept asking him why he would not run as a Democrat. As an independent, which he should have done. And his answer was, I don't want to end up like Ralph Nader. But Bernie has cut a very Faustian bargain with the Democratic Party, which he has long had. They don't put candidates up to oppose him in Vermont. They've given him committee chairmanships, and it's very clear that if he walks out of the party structure, those chairmanships are revoked, and they will use the mechanism of the party and the finances available to the party to destroy him and push him out of the Senate. I think, as I mentioned in the talk, the failure to confront militarism is absolutely crucial to throwing off the shackles of neoliberalism, and he won't do it at all. And then just on a personal level, as you know, I spent 7 years in the Middle East as the Middle East bureau chief for the New York Times. Because I'm an Arabic speaker, most of that time was in Gaza, and I am never going to sell out the Palestinian people. I don't care if I'm the last person.
I generally love to attribute at least partial responsibility for the Southern European refugee crisis to a spillover from the U.S. war in Iraq. Is that, in your estimation, fair?
Of course, because large numbers of them are coming, especially from Syria. What we've done in the Middle East, in Iraq, is, I speak as an American, is probably the most devastating strategic decision ever carried out by the United States. We've destroyed Iraq as a unified country. It's never coming back. We have spread our occupation, our drones, our militarized attacks far beyond the borders of Iraq and Afghanistan, essentially as a kind of recruiting weapon for jihadists, with all of the terror and misery that inflicts. But we've also squandered resources. Anybody who reads climate change reports at this point should realize that sane countries would declare climate change a national emergency. We don't have much time left. Even if we stop all carbon emissions today, we're still going to be confronted with very frightening and damaging effects from climate change. And yet we waltz forward. Obama has just opened the Arctic summer sea ice to drilling. It's insane. And so there's nothing within the neoliberal mechanism of corporate capitalism. There are no internal constraints, there are no external constraints. They will do what they are designed to do, which is exploit until exhaustion or collapse, both in terms of human beings and in terms of the environment. They are the most dangerous force on Earth today, and the only way we're going to stop them is to rise up and physically stop them. I don't want to trash the NDP or the Green Party, but you're not going to be saved by voting for the NDP and the Green Party. It's going to take action that's far more radical than that.
How does a journalist respond to charges of anti-Semitism when covering the Israeli-Palestinian conflict?
Well, I've been accused of that. I once gave a talk. I wrote a book called The Christian Right. It's called American Fascists, the Christian Right, and the War in America. I was trying to reach out to them. And, I gave a talk in California at All Saints, which is a great inclusive church, and a large segment of the population is GBLT, and several activists came up from the GBLT community afterwards, and they said, well, you know, how do we respond when people say that we're sick and they, you know, they love to sin or hate to sin? And my answer to them is my answer to you. Do you know the American expression, fuck you? Well, I don't see how the Middle East can get much worse. I mean, what we've done in the Middle East is just, I mean, it's not only criminal, it's just, you know, it's a project that's utterly unplugged from reality. And to reduce what's happening in the Middle East to its simplest explanation is that Muslims don't want to be occupied. They don't want to be occupied in Doha, they don't want to be occupied in Kuwait, they don't want to be occupied in Saudi Arabia, in Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Somalia, Yemen, or anywhere else. And the problem is that it was the use of industrial violence that created ISIS. When you brutalize people, they become brutal. When you bomb Cambodia in saturation bombing, you get Pol Pot. We don't see that long, slow drip of collective humiliation, frustration. We see the result, but we would be no different. And you know, I spent my time in the Middle East visiting also all of the great archaeological sites, including Palmyra, which I'm watching them destroy. It's breaking my heart. And yet at the same time, and again, to understand is not to condone, when you terrorize people like this for this long, they will finally respond in the way that they are responding. And the response of the neoliberal order is that we have to use more violence, which is just like pouring gasoline all over. So, you know, the problem is we've already broken it. We've already done what we've done. And we shouldn't have done it in the first place. But by continuing to expand the use of industrial state violence throughout the Middle East, we're not making it better. But I'm not, you know, part of ISIS's attraction, and it controls an area the size of Texas, as I said, is that it restored a semblance of order. It stopped the kidnappings, it stopped the warlords, it stopped, you know, it imposed its, you know, kind of very frightening, you know, medieval violent state, but it created order where we had broken order. And you're not wrong. And that's not an easy question to answer. But it's not going to be better by our expansion of violence and by our continued occupation.
Thank you.
Yes, I've gotten in some trouble for that, you may know.
Yes.
I mean, as a war correspondent, I was around not only prostituted women, but male violence against women. That's just a fundamental component of war. And also in every war that I covered, there was an explosion of pornography and often snuff films, rape camps. So I'm acutely aware of when societies break down, what happens to the vulnerable, and in particular what happens to girls and women. And I think this is the great failing of the left. The article you may be referring to is called Whoredom of the Left. I took it from the great writer Andrea Dworkin, who I admire very much, and who should be read and isn't, but she got it. And male violence is a separate issue towards women. You know, we can have all sorts of leftist movements that still have within their DNA heavy misogyny. And because of that misogyny and because of male violence against women, we are locking out, because of that violence, the capacity of these women to contribute and to live without fear and to enter our movement. And so I'm with, some of you may know Lee Lakeman, who I admire very much. And, you know, Lee's right, that, and this is part of her mantra, that we can't ask women to build alliances with those of us on the left until we make an ironclad commitment to do everything we can to stop male violence against women, including prostitution. I'm an anti-imperialist, an anti-capitalist, and a socialist.
Yeah.
We can't maintain capitalism. It's not maintainable. It's not sustainable. It's killing us. It's killing the planet. And we have to create communitarian structures. And I must say, traditionally, Canada has been far ahead of the United States in much of this. We did have one of the most militant working class movements in the industrialized world, but unfortunately it was, I mean, we also had the bloodiest labor wars in the industrialized world. It was really effectively crushed in the name of anti-communism. Even liberal institutions were destroyed in the name of, well, we have almost nothing left. I mean, you still have something left. We have to regain that ethic, and I know John Rosenthal has just written, I think, his latest book on kind of the ethic of indigenous First Nations communities, but the war of capitalism against those communities was not just a war to seize their land and to put them in prisoner of war camps in the United States and commit genocide, but also to destroy that ethic, because it's the inverse of capitalism, where in an indigenous community, anyone who hoards everything for themselves is despised. And we have to really implode all of the indoctrination that has been pumped into our heads to begin to look at how we can build equitable structures that will allow us to confront what's coming. And what's coming is the most sophisticated security and surveillance apparatus in the history of the world, and I covered the Stasi state in East Germany, as well as massive disruptions because of our inability to care for the planet. And that really means stepping outside the system. And so I haven't written as much about my kind of utopian vision. I mean, as you sense, I have a pretty dark view of human nature. And I don't know whether it's studying Calvin in seminary or being a war correspondent, but it's there.
But there's truth in that darkness in all of us.
Yeah, well, you see it in war.
Yes.
I mean, the most disturbing thing about covering war is you realize how easily people can be acculturated to commit atrocity.
Yeah,
and Primo Levi kind of nailed it when he wrote about it. That line between you and the oppressor is razor thin and that's what's most, that and what war does to children. It haunts those of us who come out of war. How easy it is to get people to kill. Christopher Browning wrote a very good book on this issue, Police Battalion 101, where it was one of the few police battalions sent to Poland to carry out the genocide of the Jews, and they were tried in Hamburg after the war, so we had all their testimonies. None of these people were Nazis. They were all reservists. They were all in their 40s or something, and yet they killed anyway. So, yeah, it's a long answer to your question.
Thank you.
Flying off to Europe to go on vacation. Do you?
Well, I have a cell phone, I have a car.
Say,
I don't vacation in Europe. I'm not going to give you a no on that. I mean, we are reaching a really dramatic moment. When things unravel, I know this from covering disintegrating societies, what happens is that the superstructure appears to be intact, and then everything seems to go at once. Of course, it doesn't go at once because, the foundations are being eroded, but that's kind of what worries me, that we reach a financial and an ecological tipping point. We need to do something, and it needs to be radical, and we need to do it soon. And, if I'm being vague, it's only because I don't think for myself I've quite articulated, maybe in detail what that has to be. But I hear what you're saying.
All right.
Yeah, I think what's really kind of disheartening about Canada as a periodic visitor is how, we've destroyed our universities, and those same corporate neoliberal forces are working overtime to destroy your universities. I mean, we do everything wrong, and then 5 or 10 years later, you should just look down south and go, no, we don't want it. We don't want that. Neoliberalism comes, and this is kind of Marx's brilliant. I'm not a Marxist, by the way. I mean, I think Marx's critique of capital is brilliant. I'm not with Marx on what he necessarily wanted to create. I mean, neoliberalism, as Marx understood, brings with it an ideology. And it's an ideology of the cult of the self, profligate consumption, hedonism, quote-unquote individualism. And all of that is an ethic which is set diametrically opposed to the ethic I mentioned earlier of indigenous cultures. When Marx wrote his first volume of Capitalism, I got a copy of his notebooks, which are very hard to get, but he studied in minute detail the Iroquois and how they formed their systems of government. He has incredible notes. There was a guy named Morgan who spoke Iroquois and lived among the Iroquois and wrote a book that Marx used. But it is about recovering the communal. And one of the things I worry about the intrusion of electronic, I think as the other speaker mentioned, what Derek Jensen called these electronic hallucinations, is that they keep you just where the neoliberal order wants you to be. I mean, you can, in your room in front of a Facebook page, writing angry diatribes, you're still alone in your room. And the other thing I worry about the intrusion of those electronic devices is that it destroys the capacity to think. If you're going to read Hannah Arendt, and you have to read Hannah Arendt, or if you're going to read John Ralston Saul, or if you're going to read Andrea Dworkin or Marx, you need to be in a quiet space where you can think. You can't have things in your ears. I know I'm sounding really old and my kids are going to hear this shit, but it's true. And one of the things that I worry about, you're never going to get what you need to know from the internet or from any of those systems. It is kind of like Huxley. It's all there, but they don't have to worry about it because no one reads it. You have to read Gramsci. You have to read Luxemburg. You have to read this stuff. And you have to build community, because the only hope we have now in order to sustain ourselves is rebuilding communities that the neoliberal order has destroyed. And I have 4 kids, and much of what I do is for my kids. I don't like going to jail. Going to jail is more time than I care to donate to my government. But I'm terrified of your future, of their future, and what we've done. And the legitimate anger that so many in your generation, decades from now, will look back and say, you betrayed us. And we did. And I'm talking to people my age, we have to be in the street. Because even if we fail, I want my children to look back and say, he tried. Well, it's that line between violence and nonviolence. And I'm not nonviolent. I was in Sarajevo during the war. We knew the consequences of the Serb forces if they took the city, because we'd seen them do it in the Drina Valley, in Vukovar. A third of the city would be slaughtered. The rest would be driven into refugee and displacement camps. We as journalists were targets. Snipers were, 45 of my colleagues were killed. Photographer was wounded 2 days after I got there. They intentionally were trying to kill us as press. But it is that line. I'm reading John Anderson's very fine book on Che Guevara, and who's kind of an amazing figure, much like Lenin. And he's not wrong. He was in the Arbenz coup in '54 in Guatemala and understood what the Americans were going to do. And he preempted it by carrying out hundreds of executions, in front of a firing squad. And using the brutality that Lenin used in order to take power. But once we get there, then Nietzsche's kind of right. It's our monsters against their monsters. And yet, and that's why I spent so much time talking about ISIS, and yet people get pushed. I mean, we just had 2 police officers in the United States assassinated this week. 2. And I don't know if it's a pattern, I hope it's not. But, you know, the gun violence in America is almost beyond comprehension. And people have been marching, you know, for over a year, non-violently, in all sorts of cities, and they just keep killing with impunity. And eventually, it's a natural response. It's a natural response, but it's a frightening response. It's why violent revolutions are always so tragic. And why, I mean, Lenin was right in terms of what the whites and the Western powers were going to do and the counter. I mean, he was right in the same way that Che was right, and Fidel was right. And yet, it essentially forced them to become like the people that they were, you know, in conflict with. And that's why we want to try and build nonviolent resistance while there's still time. Revolutions, in the end, are fundamentally nonviolent, and I wrote a book, Wages of Rebellion, I think they may have it. I talk about the theorists, Crane Brinton and Davies, who make the point that no revolution was ever successful, including the Cuban Revolution, until significant portions of the internal security, including the army, defect. That is true. And that's by appealing to conscience. But when you have an armed faction, like the Bolsheviks, or like the 26th of July movement, then they use that capacity for violence to shut everyone else out. That's what happened in Iran. Iran was a very diverse revolution. The universities were all communist, and Khomeini went in and essentially created his version of the Red Guard to wipe out all the competing forms of opposition. So, yeah, that's, you know, but then, you know, what happens to people like me and probably many in this room is that we become Kerensky, because I'm not going to kill on that level. It doesn't matter. I just, you know, the ends do not justify the means for me. And so in essence, you're pitted as a revolutionary who has 2 ends, i.e. an end to hold fast to the sanctity of life, against revolutionaries who only have 1 end, which is power. And there's an incredible scene in Antony and Cleopatra, which may be my favorite Shakespeare play, when I was taken prisoner in Basra during the Shiite uprising. That and a copy of the Iliad were in my pocket, where the soothsayer comes to Antony and says, don't ever go near Julius Caesar, because he's raw power. And as talented as you are and as great a work, because Antony has a measure of humanity in Shakespeare, not in real history. He killed Cicero. But that you're defenseless. And that, you know, I'm very cognizant of that, because I've covered all the revolutions in Eastern Europe. I've covered it, I've seen it. You know, if the state, and it shows no sign that it's waking up, I'm talking about most of the United States, and you talk about Rob Ford. I mean, Rob Ford is Donald Trump. I mean, it's the same phenomenon. It is that phenomenon. And they're very kind of amusing until they get into power. And then, remember, the Nazis were all lampooned in the cabarets in Berlin. Everybody laughed at them. But they're dangerous. And so, yeah, that's a kind of meandering answer, but it's something I think a lot about and that I fear. Well, you know, I don't want to speak to a Canadian audience too much about Canada, because I'm going to look stupid, because I just don't know a lot about Canada. I mean, the process of neoliberalism is, you know, eroding what you have. You still have more than we have. We have almost nothing left. But, you know, you can see what they want, which is the destruction of labor as a force. I mean, they underfund your healthcare system for a reason, which is they want it to collapse, Harper anyway. I'm not completely convinced the NDP is going to, you know, I mean, they are opposed to C-51, they have spoken out against the tar sands, but, you know, Obama promised lots of things in 2008 and delivered too much. So, I mean, I think I think, regaining a kind of militancy in terms of strikes. I mean, every time, what they do is kind of, you know, we saw this with the labor movement in the United States, is they kill you by degrees. I mean, you know, first they have this rule and that rule, and they make it impossible to strike, and then they start to organize, and then like the deal they cut with GM is that the older members got to keep their pay wages, but GM could hire new workers at $14 an hour who are not union. I mean, you know, so they do it by degrees until there's nothing left. So, I mean, my only response would be to not give them an inch, and use the muscle you have while you still have it, which means strike, strike, strike.
Yeah.
Well, I think we're seeing, I mean, in groups like Black Lives Matter, they're kind of amazing. I mean, they have the sense of identity politics, and, you know, they're very sensitive to the rights of trans and stuff like that, but they also have captured what I think a lot of the old, you know, boutique-y, identity politics their previous generation didn't, which is the primacy of justice. And the failure of the left is that it spent so much time around identity politics that it forgot to stand up for working men and women who were being destroyed and whose neighborhoods were being destroyed. And I think we're seeing with these new movements, the anti-fracking movement, I mean, these are all young, driven movements. And I have a lot of hope for them. They're certainly the people I am most comfortable with, because I certainly support, in that sense, inclusiveness and identity politics. But I also understand that if it's divorced from justice, it can become very rapidly narcissistic. And I don't see that in these new movements. I think they have a consciousness that perhaps the left, a generation before, didn't have. Yeah, I think any measure that you can take to sever yourself from corporate power is a revolutionary step. Whether that's food, whether that's communal living, whatever way you can do, currencies, local currencies, every step we take to essentially shut out corporate forces is part of the struggle. Yeah. Well, that is why I'm a socialist. I believe in full employment. I believe in universal health care. I believe in free education, including university education. I believe that the state, as it does in France, should be running daycare centers so that especially working women are not financially destroyed trying to raise a family. I believe in state-mandated payment for women who, after they have children, get 2 years of a salary while I believe in all that stuff. And the neoliberal order has created this desperation on purpose, because once people sink to that level of desperation, they're far more easily manipulated and controlled. And it's only getting worse and worse and worse. As in war zones, the people who pay the worst price are usually women and children.
Thanks to everybody for your fantastic questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of them. If you would like to check out Canadian Dimension magazine or get a subscription, please go to CanadianDimension.com.